Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz, Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, by now, everyone knows that Donald Trump is a rapacious practitioner of backroom deals. Actually, people should have realized that. There's so much evidence over the last 30 years, even before he announced his intention to run for president. That was back in 2016. But he told the reader in his The Art of the Deal to protect the downside, and the upside will take care of itself. He's already put his European allies in a black mood, got the Arab rulers searching for a response to his kind of quote unquote gentrification plan for Gaza, got Putin, I assume, to open a champagne bottle, and sat across from India's Narendra Modi, the fourth leader to be given a monarchical audience, to educate him on tariffs, reciprocity, and the preferred course of buying oil and gas from America, and also the horrendously priced F-35 stealth fighters. Now, BJP supporters on social media went euphoric, talking about Trump pulling the chair for Modi. But apparently, more discerning analysts weren't particularly impressed. For instance, Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan wrote in the print and noted that on the actual outcomes following the Trump Modi White House meeting, there's little to suggest any progress on US India ties. What we see is the favorite effort of both leaders in renaming previous agreements and coming up with what he calls cute acronyms that cannot paint over the reality that the relationship is more or less plateaued, with few ideas on how to move it forward. Now, obviously, I'll get the views on that from the panel. But for Pakistan, two issues stood out in the joint statement. One is, of course, the increased Indo-US defense cooperation in the nuclear, space, and cyber domains, which destabilizes deterrence by enhancing India's conventional capabilities. And then, of course, the mention in paragraph 29 of Pakistan and quote unquote terrorism that got a response from Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which said that Pakistan was surprised that the reference has been added to the joint statement, notwithstanding Pakistan's counterterrorism cooperation with the United States. Such references cannot cover up India's sponsorship of terrorism, subversion, and extrajudicial assassinations in the region and beyond, nor can they shift international attention from the stark reality of India being a haven for the perpetrators of hate crimes against Muslims and other minorities. To discuss where South Asia stands on Trump's priority list, what will be the likely trajectory of Indo-US relations, and how that trajectory could impact the security environment in the region, I have with me Dr. Moeed Yusuf. Yusuf is the Vice Chancellor of Beacon House National University and concurrently a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School. He also served as Pakistan's National Security Advisor and led the process of formulating the country's first ever national security policy. He has had a long stint as an academic, author, and policy expert. With him is Dr. Daniel Markey. Markey is a senior advisor on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced and International Studies. From 2003 to 7, Dr. Markey was a member of the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff, where his work focused on U.S. strategy in South Asia, especially Pakistan and India. He's the author of several books, including No Exit from Pakistan. Finally, and importantly, I have Siddharth Varadarajan, who has logged over 30 years in journalism. He was the editor of The Hindu, South Asia's largest selling newspaper, and is the founding editor of Wire.in, an online newspaper known for its independent journalism and critical reporting on political and social issues. So, gentlemen, welcome to the program. SV, let me begin with you. There's obviously the euphoria that I talked about, and then, of course, the more discerning analyses, one of which I referred to, Professor Rajagopalan's. Where do you stand on this?
No, I think the visit, frankly, served no great purpose as far as India's national interest goes. I think that Modi was very keen to register his presence early in the Trump 2.0 term, and largely, I think, for the optics domestically, but also, I think, to establish quickly with Trump that, unlike other world capitals, he represented a country and a capital that was not wary and not worried about what Trump 2.0 is going to mean for the wider world. So I think he was trying to signal to Trump, notwithstanding very important differences on trade and tariff, which were publicly aired by Trump, that as far as the wider goals of the Trump administration of upending the sort of international system, if you will, India is not discomfited by that, and this is a very different message that Trump would have got. He will not hear the same thing from his European allies. He will not hear the same thing from many sort of partners and friends in Latin America. So for I think that was a kind of broad message that probably he tried to do, and frankly, uh, for India to stick its neck out at this time and embrace, uh, you know, de facto or by default embrace some of Trump's more crazy schemes by not being vocal about it. India is perhaps the only major world power that has not publicly spoken out against the Annex Gaza plan that Trump has publicly announced. Mr. Modi has a publicly stated position that the war between Russia and Ukraine can only be settled if the two parties talk directly. But here you have an American president who is trying to end this by a unilateral parley with Russia, completely keeping Ukraine out of the picture, a country whose territory has been invaded by Russia. In terms of what this says about India's stand on important global issues, I think it's not a very positive sign. It shows a certain eagerness to align with whatever Trump is planning to do in the wider Asia Pacific region and globally. Trump extracted from Mr. Modi, all kinds of assurances on stepping up purchases of American defense equipment, oil and gas. There's talk, I think, rather unrealistic and overambitious talk of concluding a trade deal very quickly. But on important issues that concern Indians, like a major issue that offended a lot of people in India was I would say the inhumane manner in which Indian undocumented migrants have been sent back from the US. The Indian foreign minister came very close to defending Trump in Parliament when this was asked by saying, "Oh, don't worry, this is standard operating procedure." But then the Indian foreign secretary did say that India will be taking this up, and Modi had a great public opportunity, particularly for a leader who loves grandstanding before a domestic audience, to remind them that he is a nationalist leader who stands for the dignified treatment of Indians, and he didn't do that. And instead when asked a question about the Trump's crackdown on undocumented migration, he gave a kind of roundabout answer where he said he fully supports what Trump is doing. So I think that the kind of craven performance of Modi in the public events that we saw, and the really quite thin takeaway list. I mean, the joint statement is full of commitments. You have the foregrounding of defense, not just in terms of arms sales, but also in terms of bringing India the closest it's possibly been so far to working as an ally of the US. That's the intent of this joint statement. So India is doing a lot of things that it was not keen to do in the past, and I don't think this is the good thing. So net, I'm pretty pessimistic about the outcome of this visit. Modi and his supporters are convinced that Trump is good for India and Trump is good for them. I'm certain Trump is not good for India. I'm not even sure Trump is going to be good for them, quite frankly, for Modi and his they are likely to find certain difficult sort of demands that he's going to make. Tariff equalization, for example. This is something the US is committed to, but it's going to cause enormous amount of dislocation and pain for many of the companies that are supporters of Mr. Modi and the BJP. So these are, the contradictions are enormous, and I'm not sure how Mr. Modi and his advisors will square this circle of embracing America strategically and militarily, while at the same time getting screwed on the trade, on the economic front, and having the spectacle of its citizens being mistreated. Sikh deportees having their turbans removed, people being shackled and handcuffed for a 60-plus hour journey. When the government of India, nobody says undocumented India should not take back these people, but there is a way in which you do it, and India certainly has the heft and the money to ensure a more and the clout in DC to ensure more humane transfer. But Modi's failure to do all of these things are not a good sign for things as we go ahead. So that, in a nutshell, is my rather pessimistic conclusion about Mr. Modi.
I saw that. But let me play the devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
For instance, someone could say that, look, Modi knows, rest of the world is also learning, especially the European allies. I mean, the past week was pretty bleak in Europe, from Brussels to Munich. That Modi realizes that you've got a disruptor in the White House. And so you play along and just sort of suss out the situation and not ruffle too many feathers and see where it falls. And perhaps that is what India is doing. And I agree with you in the sense that even the Latin American countries said that we're not going to get the deportees if you're going to send them in military transport aircraft. And Trump relented. And all the shekels and everything, India did not do that. And as you mentioned, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, actually, I think one of the Congress MPs said that he had spoken like he was Trump's spokesperson. Is it possible that India is trying to sort of see where this falls before taking a position? Because in the past 3 years or 4 years of Biden administration, and specifically after the Russo-Ukraine war, India played its cards very well.
I think the question you ask is a valid one, and there is some merit in silence, in waiting and watching. I think Mr. Modi's visit, in some ways, however, has sent the opposite message. I think there was no need to rush there. You have an administration that is taking a flurry of initiatives, not just internally but externally. I mean, just look at the pace with which Washington has engaged with Moscow on the question of Ukraine in the last 24 to 48 hours. And, so things are unfolding very fast. I spoke to one of our former Indian ambassadors to Washington. There have been several in the last decade and a half. And one of these people, made a valid point that, their advice would have been to not rush and not be among the first to go there. Let the administration settle down. Let the world have a better sense of what's going on. See, what Trump is doing is he is kind of upending global order as we know it, right? And there's no rocket science for me to say that, but in a very important way, the post-World War II era, which we have spoken about its death in the past, after the end of the Cold War, after the end of unipolarity and so on, but its death has to be now more decisively pronounced. And the alliance system, which has sustained US hegemony globally, I think this is being reconfigured in very vital, important ways. Trump is even playing, people are talking of G3, right? He's talking about establishing a new kind of a modus vivendi with Russia, perhaps even with China, if you follow, the Indian assumption when Trump was campaigning for becoming president. The Indian assumption was that Trump will make a deal with Russia and go after China. And the Indians establishment was bullish because they were quite happy to have Trump be more confrontationist with China, because they thought that would relieve some of the pressure on India. But what's happening is that Trump is engaging Putin, but he's also not going after China in the way people had imagined. There's a much, and I'm quite impressed by the nuance that, perhaps this is a product of competing factions that are part of the sort of MAGA alliance. So you have Silicon Valley, you have the Musk people who are, who don't want to break ties with China. And Trump is taking everybody on board at this stage. So you have him, India officially believes in multipolarity. We're talking about BRICS, we're talking about SCO, but we also have good ties with the US. And here you have the US kind of nibbling away at the roots of multipolarity by saying, look, why can't I cut a deal with Moscow and Beijing? Right? So there's a lot happening. And I think rather than rushing in and declaring, because what Modi did, he went there to kiss the ring, right? He went there to say, I'm one of your reliable, trusted partners. And you are offering yourself as a reliable, trusted partner at a time when the full sort of Trump agenda has not unfolded, and the impact that this agenda is going to have is not clear. Which is why I think that waiting and watching would have been a more sensible strategy rather than rushing there.
No, a lot of what you have said, actually, I just 2 days ago, I did this program on how Trump is operating and this whole upending of the existing order. And in fact, just kicking the chessboard and start playing solitaire. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence emerging now, and we'll see as the days and months go by, that he's actually looking at spheres of influence in terms of reaching out to Putin also, in terms of reaching out to Xi Jinping also. I think his approach to China is going to not be what people thought it would be. But that's a separate discussion. General Markey, you have been a long-time watcher of South Asia, specifically India and Pakistan, both in terms of US-India, US-Pakistan, and the Indo-Pakistani relations. What are your first impressions of this meeting and what transpired? How much of it was just photo op and cute acronyms, and sort of pulling the chair for Mr. Modi and the rest of it, and how much of it do you think was substantive?
Well, you've already covered a lot of great ground, and I agree with a good portion of what's already been said. If we step back and think about how pundits broadly would have rated a situation, say 6 months ago during the Biden administration, had they sent Indian illegal migrants back to India on military flights in shackles and announced a raft of reciprocal tariffs. Obviously, there would have been howls of anger across the board, and a sense that Washington was really attempting to break the US-India relationship. And of course, now, after both of those things have happened with the Trump administration, you're hearing something quite different, which is, this is a new guy in town. We have to manage this relationship. And frankly, and maybe correctly, it could be a lot worse. And I think, so it's this recalibration of expectations, which is the real shift that's happened. And so if you unpack that a little bit, one thing you would say is there's actually a good logic to, contrary to Siddharth's point, there's a good logic to getting in early, having FaceTime with this particular American president, because he really values that. Seems a great deal more than many other American presidents. And there is a sense, certainly here in Washington, that having gotten on his schedule early, India achieved something, demonstrated that it was more important in a way to the Trump administration's grand vision for the international chessboard than many other countries. And you see how the Trump administration has been playing its NATO allies much more negatively. And India, by comparison to that, comes out looking reasonably good. So maybe a degree of kissing the ring, a gingerness of dealing with this new American presidency. But obviously time will tell, but it looks like maybe in the near term, what that did was cushion some of the blows that would have otherwise had the potential to knock the US-India relationship completely off the rails, and under different circumstances might have. And then simultaneously, you have this joint statement, which I agree is mainly filled with a kind of old wine in new bottles approach to policymaking, a lot of new acronyms and things like that. But basically, a lot of the projects of the previous administration remain intact. And for many in the policy community watching this closely would say, well, that's about all you could possibly expect after 3 weeks in office, that there would be a kind of a joint endorsement of a series of policies that have been underway for some time, a desire to work through some of the trade differences over the next year, which I agree, by the way, it's going to be exceptionally difficult to actually make any of that work. But that's a whole lot better than simply seeing India kind of on the sidelines, I think, taking the reciprocal tariff announcement from a distance and being lumped in with the rest of the world, which I think is the relevant alternative. So while I would say, this was definitely a mixed bag of an outcome, and judged under different circumstances would actually be seen as a setback in the U.S.-India relationship for all the reasons that Siddharth pointed out. Under the circumstances, it wasn't nearly so bad. And relative to some of the other U.S. relations with other countries with whom we consider ourselves allies, not even just strategic partners, India came out at least relatively ahead. So that's my general characterization.
Okay. A quick follow-up, Daniel. So as I mentioned to Siddharth also, in the last 4 years, and even going back, India has played its cards very well in the sense that, despite deteriorating relations between the United States and Russia, it has kept its legacy relationship intact with Russia. It has been very mealy-mouthed with reference to the Ukraine war. And it has been getting oil and gas at hugely discounted prices. It's also part of BRICS. And BRICS has, more or less trying to emerge as a kind of counterweight to G7, if you will. Similarly, it's also part of SCO. Now, Trump. And Trump essentially deals with people, just to, sort of extend the metaphor that I use with reference to monarchical audience and what SV said about kissing the ring. He's not dealing with partners, he's dealing with satraps. So my point is, and where I want to get your take, moving forward, do you think that India is biding its time and thinks that, like many others perhaps also, that this is a bump in the road and 4 years, but, things will come back to normal and let's bide our time? Or do you think that Trump is going to say, okay, we do X, Y, Z for you. How about you do ABC for us? And if doing that ABC, counter to what India's interests are with reference to Russia or BRICS or SCO, do you think that would reduce space for India to operate?
Look, there are a lot of different pieces to that question. One of them is the question of whether Trump is a kind of a momentary or temporary shift in American approaches to the world, or whether this represents something deeper. And of course, we don't know, but obviously the concern in many circles, certainly in Europe and among traditional US allies, is that this is a fundamental shift that will stick in the way that that the United States deals with the world. That Trump is not a momentary aberration, that whether it's spheres of influence, approach to the world, or a kind of prioritizing competition with China, but pulling back from much of the rest of the world, sort of a restraint plus competition with China approach, or whether it's something else altogether, it certainly isn't a defense of the liberal world order of international institutions that were backed by American power to some extent for decades. So it's a fundamental shift, at least for the time being. And I think India has to appreciate it for that. Now, whether they can kind of cut narrow deals and get by and make the most of it, I think that's precisely how they perceive Donald Trump to be, as a kind of a businessman on steroids, a businessman in the White House, that all you can possibly do with this person is to make specific deals that play to his interests one way or another. And if those deals are things that are reasonably acceptable to the Indian national interest, then you can move forward on them. And in the process, if you can also get something good for India, or at least something relatively less bad in the terms of, say, tariffs in particular, or visa arrangements going forward, then that's a win too. So that's where the game will be played. But long term, this is potentially, and I think has to be seen as a threat to something much larger, as a much more significant shift.
I agree with you, because while we keep talking about external relations, a lot is going on internally in terms of how Trump is trying to reconfigure the federal government, and much of that could actually, if it goes through, is likely to change the United States internally in certain significant ways. But let me pull in Dr. Moeed Yusuf, who's been listening very patiently to this discussion. Moeed, a word about where does this leave us in terms both of US-Pakistan relations as also Indo-Pakistan relations?
Thanks, Ejaz. It's a pleasure to be on your program always. Look, I mean, first of all, let me just say, I actually am more on Dan's sort of side than SV's in terms of Modi's choice of timing. I think this is all grandstanding at the end of the day. I don't think anybody thought that a one-day trip is going to deliver anything substantive for the India-US relationship. I think it's a queue of leaders who want to be seen next to Trump to show that their country is very important for him. And that's, I think, the only thing that was going to be achieved. And I do think he's sort of managed that. Now, in terms of Pakistan, I think it's incidental. So the mention of Pakistan, India's got this perfectly sort of placed and almost muscle memory now that whenever you talk about Pakistan, you must use the same language about terrorism to reinforce what the West has actually bought, which is, oh, look, Pakistan, there's a mention of terrorism. India always says Pakistan's perpetrating terrorism. Pakistan started doing this about 4 or 5 years ago very regularly. It doesn't stick in the West. It's not because it's not true. It's not because of what's happening on the ground, whether in India or Pakistan, but it's because the interests don't align in that way with Pakistan. I was in the US very recently. I mean, I can tell you Pakistan's simply just not a conversation. And India is very much a conversation. There's a bipartisan consensus, I would argue, in Washington on just 3 countries, China in the negative and Israel and India in the positive for the most part. And so I don't think it's neither here nor there. And I don't think the US administration was thinking about Pakistan when Pakistan was put in the joint statement. On the terrorism part, it's pretty much standard Indian language. If it doesn't come, it's a surprise. If it comes, it's muscle memory that kicks in. I wouldn't take it too seriously either ways. And the question ultimately then is, how important overall is South Asia for Trump, right? I mean, is India even going to make it in the top 5, top 10 or whatever? I think the jury is out. I don't think he's thinking of South Asia every day. I think he's thinking of China. I'm one of those who feels that he's not going to take on China. I think China is going to show its usual sort of, inward-looking patience, and I actually think they will probably find a way to get along while he deals with all the other allies and takes care of those relationships in a very disruptive way. Europe, Canada, whatever else.
No, I mean, frankly, at the Munich Security Conference, Wang Yi scored much higher than J.D. Vance among the Europeans. So there you are. But here's the thing, Moeed. I agree with you. Whatever you have said, I agree with it 100%. But there is now also very clear evidence, not something that we are saying in Pakistan, not our dossiers, but the Five Eyes evidence in relation to, if nothing else, the Indian intelligence attempts on foreign soils to kill foreigners. They did it successfully in Canada. They were unsuccessful in New York. The Australian intelligence agency had to get rid of 5 or 6 Indian operatives. They did not name India, but the Australian media named India, and so on and so on. And Washington Post has come out with stories actually talking about how they've been killing people inside Pakistan. So there is a lot of evidence of that now. Do you believe that Trump is not really even interested in the wordings of the joint statement, and therefore India managed to slip in its, as you mentioned, muscle memory language with reference to Pakistan, but nothing could be done in terms of how the Biden administration, of course, was pushing India against the wall on what the Indian intelligence or operators are presumably doing.
I think two different things, right? I mean, getting in something on what India is doing, I think it's a question why the US administration did not do that and they didn't feel the need to do that. The Pakistan part is totally separate, right? I mean, again, it's just a low cost option. It's a muscle memory option. The US system, of course, has bought that for a long time, and the distrust with Pakistan actually has made it easier every time to put this in a statement. If you look at US India joint statements, I think going back 20 years, you'll find it every time, pretty much the same language. On what India is doing, look, I mean, the question is not what India is doing or not doing. I mean, that's pretty clear. I am, I've made myself very unpopular because you know this, that I was in office at the time that this was started, right? In terms of Pakistan putting out what's happening. So, I mean, nobody needs to convince me because I've seen this information. But this game has gone on forever, right? I mean, Pakistan and India haven't spared an opportunity in terms of making sure that they can prick the other and remind them that they're still here. So it's happening. That's not under debate as far as I'm concerned. The issue is that Pakistan is not an important enough conversation, I think, for the US to take a stand on this particular issue. And I think that's where the US-Pakistan equation has to be thought through. What are those elements or what are those aspects on which we still align and are important enough for either the US or Pakistan to find a way to stand together on these things. But when it comes to US-India, I think Pakistan's going to be the casualty.
Right. So, Moeed, is it better for us to just simply stay below the radar?
Versus what? I mean, the point is
versus getting noticed by Mr. Trump.
How? I mean, the entire country.
So my point being that I hope that South Asia, in its entirety, is not Trump's immediate priority, and within South Asia, Pakistan is not Trump's priority.
Look, Ejaz, the point is, you sit in a room with the opposite number, right? What's the conversation that you want to have? If the conversation is about strategy, if the conversation is about Pakistan not wanting to be in a particular camp, if the conversation is how Pakistan can help in South Asia, if the conversation is that if we move to a geoeconomic paradigm, Pakistan can help wean Central Asia off Russia, those are all conversations I think the Americans will be interested in. If the conversation you want to have is about domestic politics, then I'm sorry, but it's just not going to go anywhere. So the point is...
The thing. Yeah, I get your point. I'm just quickening the pace because, I need to close the loop and, here's the thing. Trump's idea of policy making is, I don't know if he has read Morton Halperin's book, but if he has, he has upended the entire thing. I mean, it's not 20% presidential instinct and 80% of the bureaucracy, old hands, the Sherpas doing the thing. It's Trump thinking of something and then everyone else giving it a policy intellectual underpinning. So to me, it seems that it's kind of going towards spheres of influence. And I think this whole dilemma, or shall I say trilemma, of which camp Pakistan needs to belong to is going to, by the end of Trump's 4 years, will become irrelevant.
Yeah, I think maybe you're right. I think the question is, Pakistan wants to be relevant. Pakistan is a very important country, but do you want to be below the radar or above the radar? The question I'm asking you is, what is on offer from Pakistan? What are you putting on the table in terms of the conversation?
I'm saying, let's not put anything extraordinary or seemingly extraordinary on the table. I mean, there are already relations, and let that just trundle along.
Sure. I mean, I don't think
instead of reaching out with something like Bilal did, saying that we could be the bridge between China and the United States.
look, you can't do that with a disruptor, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if there's so much disruption, let me ask you a simple question. Pakistan has one of the largest trade surpluses with the United States. If there's going to be reciprocal tariffs tomorrow, that's the end of the export market that
But
Pakistan
on the
has.
plus side, on the plus side, we export really low value added. If we were exporting high value added, we would probably have come into that sort of.
No, you still come into that. Look, no, you still come into that. Look, the vulnerability is still there, right? I mean, it's because ultimately, if there is going to be any imposition of tariffs, that's the end of exports. If there's going to be any pressure from the IMF, that's going to be another vulnerability you have to deal with. So I'm not quite sure that just sleeping over it is going to help. But if you want to be proactive, which would be my view, then there has to be a clear storyline, a pitch, and what benefit the US is going to get and what the US is going to give in return. Get over this emotional foreign policy, whatever. It's a transactional world. Make the transaction.
Then offer Trump land in Islamabad and ask him to build a Trump Tower. I think that will interest him much more. But anyway, SV, in your first remarks, you talked about India's national interest, that Mr. Modi's visit did not serve India's national interest. I would like you to sort of, if you could lay out the contours of what you think is India's national interest. Because the BJP people will say, look, we have got so much from the United States, and we are likely to get more in terms of goodies and the rest of it. So is there a difference between how the BJP looks at India's national interest and the rest of India looks at it, or are there any determinants that are common?
I'll answer that. But then I also want to come cross over to the India-Pakistan-US bit in a second, but I will answer the question that you asked. I think that closer India-US relations has been a fact of life for the last 2 decades.
Correct.
And it has happened regardless of who is in the White House, and it's happened regardless of who is the Prime Minister of India, which party is in power, right? I would say perhaps even going back, we normally date this from Atal Bihari Vajpayee, but I would say go back even earlier to Rajiv Gandhi. There's been
I will go back to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and JFK's forgotten.
Well, but after that there were roller coasters. There was ups and downs. Yeah. But there's been a consensus in the Indian establishment for the last 2.5 decades, 3 decades, that you need to have closer economic relations with the US. You need to have, of course, closer political, social, cultural ties with the US, and also see what you can get from the US in terms of defense technology. The balance that India has had to strike is how can you extract the maximum in terms of technology, in terms of weaponry, such that it is cost effective, such that it can be integrated with everything else that you have, without, going further down the road towards a partnership or an alliance with the US, particularly when it comes to power projection in the wider Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region. So India has been, India is happy to play along with the Quad. India is not keen for the Quad to become an Asian NATO. So this balance has been, it's a fine balance, but I think it's one that all governments in the past, and even Modi in his first 2 terms, have been mindful of, right? So even though Modi has taken India the closest any prime minister has in terms of, a tighter military embrace with the US, but he's been mindful of the fact that you can't go too far. What I think Modi has, the path he has gone down is of offering to step even further down that alliance or partnership path. And I think that's not in India's interest. And I think, and the irony is that you're making that offer at a time when what the US itself wants is not particularly clear. So I think that, which is why I think that I think it's, registering an early presence is all very well, but Modi went and played a certain set of cards that I think ought not to have been played ever, let alone at this time.
Okay.
On the question that you were discussing earlier with Moeed, frankly, I think one should not make too much of the reference to Pakistan and terror. I just went back while Moeed was speaking and checked the language of the Biden-Modi joint statement of 2023.
Yeah.
And the para on terrorism in Pakistan is virtually identical.
Yeah.
There's a reference to punishing the guilty and so on and so forth. And frankly, nothing has changed. And if you ask me as an analyst, I think these phrases are anyway quite meaningless, because what is essential is that India and Pakistan, in terms of their own relations, need to have a certain amount of clarity. And I think that India itself knows that the salience of terrorism as a bilateral issue today is much less than what it was a decade ago, right? So, you want to call this muscle memory or playing to the domestic gallery, all of that is there. But, I don't think this is a big issue for Trump. What worries me, Moeed, and you were talking about Central Asia. I think Pakistan's dilemma is that, I don't think Trump is interested in weaning Central Asia away from Russia. If he's willing to acknowledge that Russia has a stake in the territory of Ukraine, Central Asia is even further away from his core interest. Right?
That's where the spheres of influence.
Exactly. But what worries me, and I think this is where I think Pakistani analysts need to pay attention, is that depending on how Trump's wider West Asia policy goes, and the extent to which he, embraces the idea that Iran has to be targeted more aggressively, that is likely to give Pakistan, in Trump's eyes, greater strategic salience. And that's a bad thing for Pakistan. It's a bad thing for the region. And I sincerely hope that Trump doesn't go down that path, and that Pakistan isn't confronted with this dilemma of being able to draw closer to a Trumpian US, but at the cost of turning its western border with Iran into a hot zone. So I think that Trump is going to leave South Asia alone. It's not an area of high priority for him. India, he looks at as an economic partner, and Pakistan, it has some economic strengths, but is not really in the same ballpark, as it were. The priority of Pakistan would obviously have to be to focus on its economy. I don't think that Trump is going to be looking at, I don't think Pakistan needs to worry about what Trump is just going to ignore Pakistan. The extent to which, India-Pakistan relations are, what Pakistan has to ensure is that there is no, the extremist groups that are there are not able to destabilize, India and Pakistan today have no relationship worth the name.
Yeah.
And it's a bad thing, but it's what could be worse is if these two countries which have no relationship once again go into freefall. So I would prefer the current status quo of us having no relations to one where there is tension and violence and so on and so forth.
Right.
I don't think
and then I want to go to Daniel and then close.
So just a final point, I don't think the assassinations that the Washington Post spoke about is something which is going to concern the US or going to concern the Five Eyes or the world at large. I think that I don't think Trump is going to drop the assassination allegation, the Pannu assassination allegation. I think that targeting an American citizen, the allegation that India targeted an American citizen in New York is not something that the MAGA people can easily reconcile themselves to. In fact, Biden would have found it easier to reconcile himself to it than Trump is going to do. That's my sense. But I don't think that the other things, the other instances that you mentioned of targeted assassinations of various extremist elements inside Pakistan, where the figures will point, I don't think that's going to figure very largely in Trump's mind or in the mind of the.
Moeed, you wanted to add something?
I was just going to say, I think I completely agree with Siddharth. This whole idea of the geoeconomics for Pakistan and cooperative geoeconomics was that the one thing Pakistan will not want ever again is to be above or on the radar, if you will, because of a conflict. because that's what's hurt Pakistan throughout. So in that sense, it's correct. But Siddharth, where I disagree with you, I think for Washington, the economic part of India, yes and no. India is really seen as a counterweight to China, which India doesn't think it wants to be. But the real lens on India, frankly, is China, not the market size or anything around that. So I think that.
But can we be so sure Trump is?
We can have a separate discussion on that. But my own sense is that this China thing is more a Beltway think tankers issue rather than Trump's issue. But as I said, we can have a separate discussion on that. Daniel, you can comment on something that has already been said. But my question to you is that we are, and lots of other people are also talking about how Trump is going to deal with the world and the rest of it. My own sense is, and I want to get your corroboration or otherwise on this, that I don't really think that the traditional policy-making circles in the United States are very clear about where Trump is going.
Yeah, a short answer to that is yes, you're absolutely right. There's a depth of uncertainty about the direction that this president will actually take his government in a second round. That's unlike anything that I've ever seen before, and probably anyone's seen in a very long time. That can't be understated. And appointments are not everything. But all we have to go on right now are some of his personnel appointments. We're sort of reading the tea leaves there, and some of these initial statements. And yet we still don't really know what his intentions are. And, you know, to some extent, he plays that as if it's a bluff. And he may or may not, as he undertakes negotiations, be serious about them. And we're all left to have to play along and see what we can get. And that's how other countries are seeing it, including India, including Pakistan. But let me do follow up with some of the other points, because I thought the conversation's been fascinating so far. On India and this Indian government, I would say, I believe, I anticipate that there's actually sort of under the sort of the public rhetoric about being comfortable with Trump, there is a discomfort, because there must be a recognition that they actually had a really good deal going with the Biden administration, which frankly was willing to bend over backward on a number of different points, make concessions on key favorable to India. And so even though there's this sort of rhetorical nod to being comfortable with dealing with Trump, I think there's a deeper disquiet there, which really was the motivator for this visit. And yet there's also a sense that they understand Trump's style. They understand some of the logic of, you called it sort of a monarchical approach to governing. And they may even be somewhat comfortable with aspects of an approach to the world that looks a bit like spheres of influence, as long as those spheres give to India what it believes its due is, which is a sphere of influence across South Asia. So to the extent that we're seeing the sort of the initial nuggets of a US South Asia strategy, I think I hear it in when Trump says, look, Bangladesh is not our issue. We'll leave that to Prime Minister Modi. So there's a sense that India and its neighborhood are India's problem and not the United States' problem. And I don't think we would have heard precisely that formulation out of prior American presidents, who would have wanted to have independent relationships with India's neighbors outside of, even though they might have tried to get along or square those relationships in their dealings with New Delhi. So that's point one. Point two, Pakistan. One of the things that could put Pakistan on the Trump agenda is not just a war with India or a crisis with India or something like that, but an issue that dropped at the tail end of the Biden administration, which was this allegation that Pakistan is pursuing ICBM capabilities. And the whole point of that announcement out of the Biden administration was to force it onto the agenda of the incoming Trump administration and to make a public issue out of it. And so the question there is whether the new Trump administration will bite and whether they'll take that up. And I don't think that that would be an issue that Pakistan would be happy to have as center of its agenda with the United States. So something to keep in mind. And then last point, I said that personnel matters a great deal. India couldn't be happier, I think, with the various appointments that have been made so far in the policy space by the Trump administration. You have Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, Brian Mast is not an appointment, but basically a Trump pick for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Paul Kapoor coming in at the State Department. And you talked about the Panoon issue or the murder for hire business. We didn't talk about the Adani affair, but Trump is going to assert and has already asserted control over the Justice Department in ways that could ease or make those issues completely disappear if they so choose. So across the board, this is a group that will be eager to work with India, has clearly expressed that, and frankly has no patience for Pakistan. And I think, recognizing that that's the starting position for all of this is critically important.
I think I would agree with Daniel on this, and specifically Daniel's point about Finer's statement is something. I actually did a program on that, and I completely agree with you. And I thought that the reason they had come out publicly on this was to actually lock the incoming administration into that issue. But gentlemen, thank you so much. Fascinating insights. I'm really grateful to all three of you. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. It doesn't get me Luca, but it certainly makes me happy. And it also helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.